Hello, folks. Welcome to today's webinar, Getting to Know the IIJA. There's a lot of us in the room today. I would like to think you're all here to see me, but as I said to Leslie earlier, $1 trillion will help bring folks out and want to have a little chat. So uh, that's what we're going to do today. A few opening notes before I get started. First off, I want to give a disclaimer that what I'm going to present today is really just a small sample of the overall bill. I'm going to focus quite a bit on the transportation piece, but even with that, I'm really only able to touch on some of what's there, certainly not go into the level of detail that the bill contains, but I'm trying to give you sort of a general overview and idea of what it is that the bill does contain. I beg your pardon for any mistakes that I might make, either here or in the analysis that we've done. Sorry about that, if there are any, but there is a lot in there, and sometimes things do get missed. And finally, I'm going to give an unbelievable amount of detail today. Quite frankly, probably too much detail for this kind of a forum, but I'm left with no choice. This is an extremely long and detailed bill with an unbelievable amount of new material in it. And so that's just the nature of what we're facing here now and going forward as we get acquainted with this bill and everything that it contains. So hopefully we can keep it lively and not bore anybody to tears too very much. So as I get started, as I mentioned, there are quite a few folks on today. I wanted to start by with a poll, if I could. I'd love to get a sense of where folks are reaching us from. So I'll leave this open just for a couple minutes, but I would love to get a sense where you work and what brings you here to the webinar today. As expected, lots of participation from regional organizations. We also have some folks from local and county government, a few state government folks, some lobbyists and consultants, and then a few from the nonprofit association world. All right, I'm gonna leave this open for a few more seconds if folks still want to weigh in. Really appreciate your doing this. It's just nice to know who we're talking with and who this information is getting out to. All right, so why don't we go ahead and here, I'll actually go ahead and share the results if folks want to see where folks are from. Again, unsurprisingly, most of you from MPOs, RTPOs, regional councils, and COGS. So like, all right, so let's go ahead and get started with today's information. I'm going to start off. Let's see if I can advance my slides here. All right. So of course, the bill leaving the station, the thing we're here to talk primarily about today is the infrastructure bill. That bill does include a full transportation reauthorization, obviously very important for much of the work that is done. It contains a lot more. I'm going to get into all of that. I did want to point out that we still have a number of items that are stuck at dysfunction junction. That includes, very importantly, the reconciliation package. I'm sure folks are quite aware of this soft infrastructure bill that was stymieing the passage, frankly, of the infrastructure bill for quite a while until they were able to decouple them last week. The new agreement stands at $1.75 trillion. It's pretty clear that probably even a smaller bill than that's going to be required to get this past the Senate. But the House is still working on passage of a smaller package to send over to the Senate, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Also tied up is government funding. The entire government currently is operating under a continuing resolution that expires on December 3rd. And now the debt ceiling was also extended until that December 3rd date. So the early December timeframe is going to be extremely active and interesting. The National Defense Authorization Act still needs to get completed, and there's some increasing questions about how that's going to get done. So you can see that even though we did get the infrastructure bill through, which is great, there is still a lot of work. It's still going to be a very interesting last month plus of legislating here in Washington, and lots to keep our eye on. But let's dive into the IIJA. Not a great acronym to say out loud. I apologize. The bid was certainly better. The bill contains over $1 trillion in total spending. About $550 billion of that is new spending. And this includes, as I mentioned, a full transportation reauthorization, also reauthorizes some water bills, has funding for power generation and transmission, for electric vehicles, resiliency, airports, broadband, and even more beyond that. This was primarily a Senate negotiated package. I'm sure folks are very well aware of that, but the package that the Senate sent over to the House passed the House completely unchanged and went to the president. So anything you learned about this package in August when the Senate passed it, all of that remains exactly the same with the passage of in the House. As folks, I'm sure, again, are aware, 69 votes in the Senate coming out of the Senate, and then it passed the House on Friday by a vote of 228 to 206. That includes 13 Republican yeses and 6 Democratic noes. We could probably spend the entire webinar talking about the intrigue that was last Friday for anybody that was paying attention. You know, we had votes left open for record amounts of time, upwards of 7 hours. You know, we had a lot of back and forth between different factions. We had the LaHood Thanksgiving table getting a lot more interesting as Mr. LaHood, who was supporting the package, there was a no vote from his son, who was in the House. So, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So we'll leave it at that. But it was a very interesting day that ended very late Friday night. But the House was able to finally get that bill passed. And as mentioned, it's now heading to the president for his signature. So first question is what's in the bill in terms of funding. You can see by this chart, this gives these boxes are sort of in relative size to the amount of funding that these areas receive within the new spending that's in the bill, the $550 billion that's in the bill. And so you can see transportation receives almost exactly half of that $550 billion, with significant portions going to roads and bridges, to rail, to public transit, also significant investments in airports, ports, safety, and some other areas. Another bucket that the White House is calling energy, environment, and climate, that includes investments in water infrastructure, those reauthorizations that I mentioned, significant investments in resilience, in power infrastructure, as I mentioned, $65 billion going there, and then significant funding for some environmental remediation work. I'll get into a little bit of the details on a few of these areas. And then a very significant federal investment into broadband as well. So you kind of get a little bit of a sense of what this bill contains in terms of the new spending that it contains. So one thing I do like to point out to folks, just to clarify and allay confusion, there's really 3 flavors of spending that is contained in the IIJA. First, you've got your Highway Trust Fund spending. This is the money that really flows traditionally, that flows through the reauthorization bill. So that's your base authorization, what the levels that were in the FAST Act, plus increases to those programs. And that's what was funded out of the Highway Trust Fund. In addition to those funds, which primarily covered many parts of the reauthorization bill, you also had a separate investment in what they called guaranteed appropriations. Often when folks hear appropriations, they assume that means that there's going to have to be some additional action taken by the appropriating committees in order to make those funds real. But in this case, that's not how they structured things. So these guaranteed appropriations are real money. So now that this bill has passed, when that bill is signed, those funds are there. So that increases some existing programs. It creates some new programs, both in transportation and otherwise. But those guaranteed appropriations are real funding, real money that will be spendable once the bill is signed into law. And then finally, as always, mostly within the reauthorization bill, there are always there's always general funds that are authorized, and they do require future action by the appropriating committees. And so there is some of that in this bill. Most of that are items that are traditionally handled in this manner, often because they don't fall under the Highway Trust Fund and don't have a trust fund of their own, specifically thinking about, for example, rail. And rail is a very interesting example in this context as well, because rail, the FRA is going to get $66 billion through the guaranteed appropriations. And that's the number that everybody is seeing. But there's actually another $36 billion in appropriated funds, in authorized funds, that will require future action by the appropriating committee. But the total investment in rail could actually be much higher than what the sort of frontline number is, and actually come up to somewhere over $100 billion if all of those funds are appropriated as have been authorized. And so all of this creates a little bit of confusion about what the bill actually contains, because there's all these different pots of money. For example, with the bridge program, there's $27.5 billion going to a formula program, all of that coming through this guaranteed appropriations. You've got a $3.3 billion competitive program funded with highway trust fund dollars, another $9.2 billion also competitively, that will be competitively bid through guaranteed appropriations. And then there's an additional $3.3 billion, which will be competitive, but has to be authorized at some point has to be appropriated in the future. So you can see it's extremely confusing to see kind of what the bill contains. It takes a lot of flipping back and forth between those guaranteed appropriations and the reauthorization portion itself. But all of this is to say that there's frankly an enormous amount of funding in this bill, and much of it is going to competitive grant programs, and that's part of what the focus here today is to walk you through some of those. So there, I did see a question. There was about the difference between the $1 trillion, the $1.2 trillion number, and the $550 billion new spending, and I'll get into that in just a minute. So don't worry if that doesn't make any sense to you. So I just wanted to put a finer point on the fact that of the flavors of spending, the highway trust fund dollars and the guaranteed appropriations dollars are in the bill to be spent. That is money that does not require any future action. And with the bridges, as I mentioned, those top three lines, all of those total about $40 billion. All of that is in this bill. It is possible that program could grow to as high as $43+ billion if the appropriators take action on the $3.3 billion additional. All right, so what's in the bill for transportation? Obviously, as mentioned, a full FAST Act reauthorization with significant funding increases. There are a number of new formula and discretionary programs, both within the reauthorization program and outside of reauthorization as well. Some of these are created in the context of reauthorization. Some of them that are funded by only guaranteed appropriations are new programs, but they're basically added on. They're not really part of the overall reauthorization structure. So in other words, when reauthorization comes up next time, those aren't necessarily going to be part of the base bill, but would have to be sort of brought in if there are any programs that they want to retain as authorized transportation programs going forward. The dollar totals are fairly significant, I would say. $567.5 billion going to US DOT alone. 351 billion of that is for federal highways, 91 billion for federal transit, and the total, as I mentioned, the total bid increase is $550 billion, and the difference between that and the 1.2 or the $1.2 trillion figure is that in many cases, at least in the case of the reauthorizations, there's a baseline built in. So, for example, the FAST Act baseline is $293 billion. That's the spending level that was contained in the FAST Act. So as far as new spending, the new spending for transportation reauthorization are the amounts above that $293 billion. And so that $293 billion would be part of the difference between the $550 billion and the $1.2 trillion. And that's just the way that accounting, especially for transportation, but really for all reauthorized programs, works. The baseline is assumed to continue into the future. So the new spending within a bill like this is what is added on top of that baseline. So in this case, $293 billion baseline, add to that $274 billion in new spending, which, as I mentioned, is about half of the total new spending within the bill. And that breaks down, there's $90 billion in contract authority. So this is essentially the authorization increases, so increases to things like surface transportation block grant program, that's all done through contract authority. So they built in about $90 billion to increase the actual size of the transportation bill itself. And then another $184 billion is provided in new programs and other increases through the guaranteed appropriations. I hope all of this is making sense. It's a lot of numbers to throw at you, but needless to say, basically what it represents are enormous increases in resources for a number of programs that already exist, and then the creation of a whole lot of new programs. So also here is about $274 billion also for non-transportation related spending. I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I did think it was important to touch on a few of the programs that are contained in the legislation, particularly the ones that would be of greatest interest to folks that work on regional issues. So you can see a sort of a different breakdown than what the administration had, where they broke it down by climate and some other categories. I did an analysis that broke it down essentially by agency to some extent, although broadband kind of stands out as its own, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of where some of the spending is going. So the $67 billion, for example, going to EPA is for clean water and drinking water state revolving funds to work on lead pipes, to do brownfields and Superfund cleanups. Under broadband, the biggest chunk are for grants to states and also for vouchers to help reduce the cost of high-speed internet for folks that need assistance. There's also things on digital equity there, so middle mile project type funding. Under energy, much of that is energy efficiency and renewables. That also includes some funding for weatherization, which I know is something of interest to folks. Also includes funding for transmission, clean energy research, innovation, things like that. There's funding for the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation for water projects. That includes some flood mitigation work, Western water storage, not waster storage. And then interior, there's funding for cleaning up abandoned mines, plugging wells, also for fire management. And then finally under FEMA, there's some funding for the National Flood Insurance Program and for storm mitigation as well. So this is sort of a little bit of a different breakdown to some of the categories that the White House used, but I think folks, I think it gives you a little bit of a different look of some of the types of things that are funded in here. All right. So additionally, in the bill for transportation, let's get into the meat of the reauthorization at least, and you can get a sense here for what the 5-year funding totals are for this under this legislation, and then the relative increase in that funding compared to the 5 years of the FAST Act. So you can see for the sort of most important programs, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, for example, sees a 24% increase. Highway Safety Improvement, 34%. Couple new formula programs, Carbon Reduction and Protect, that I'll get into in a little bit. Those are new, so obviously no increase from last time, and you can see their totals. CMAQ, a slightly smaller increase relative to some of the other programs, but does see a 10% increase in funding. TAP, I think, stands out as really getting a very significant increase in funding. I'll get into some of the details on some of the changes to TAP, but you can see a very significant bump in total funding there. And then a nice bump for metropolitan planning funding as well, both highway and transit side. So one of the things that we're going to get into and talk about are the sort of bifurcation between the amount of funds in this bill for formula funding and for discretionary grants. One of the things to note is that when you talk about discretionary grants, those are funds that are going to be, the decision making is going to ultimately be made in Washington by USDOT and the Secretary's office. Formula funding, we've long advocated for as really the best way to get funds out to a much broader array of recipients at the local level, especially. And so the fact that there's a couple of new formula grants, but that's up against a very significant increase in discretionary funding. I mean, those discretionary grants are great, but it's not quite the same as distributing funds to every state and then having a portion of that go down to the local level, which is really the way that we prefer the funding go out. But that said, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for folks within those discretionary grants, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. So in addition to the 2 formula programs created under the reauthorization bill, there's also some additional formula programs outside of reauthorization that include the Bridges program that I mentioned, money for EV charging, and also for transit state of good repair. So that's funding where some portion of it will go to every state, and then from there be distributed to the recipient, either the state DOT or down to the local level. As I mentioned, there's really dozens of new discretionary programs, not all of them regionally specific or focused, but literally throughout the bill, there's dozens of them scattered throughout, plus a large number of new pilot programs, which in many ways act very similar to the discretionary programs, where you'll apply for funds and then be approved or not by USDOT. So to give you a little bit of a sense of the scope of the bill, there are 42 different sections within this bill that have an impact on or involve some action by MPOs or RTPOs. Included in that is 2 new formula programs, 11 new competitive grant programs, and 6 competitive pilot programs. And here to put a finer point on the amount of resources that is available for USDOT decision making, you can see that competitive grant column. This is just from funds through guaranteed appropriations. This doesn't even include all the total from things that are in reauthorization. USDOT is going to have upwards of $100 billion in resources to distribute over the next 5 years under this package, which is just a staggering number relative to anything that we've ever seen before. All right, so let's get into some of what's in the bill. I'm going to start with some of the policy changes. I think good for folks to hear. Under Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, we hope to increase the suballocation percentage, the percentage that's provided down to the local level for decision making through the MPOs. We would hope to increase that from 55%, but we maintained it 55% through the life of this bill. The bill does modify the population bands within the program. So I'm sure folks are aware, if you're over 200,000, your MPO has ostensible control over where the funding goes, and is required to receive a proportional share of the funds relative to the percentage of the entire population. So the relative percentage of the and I'm sorry, let me start that over. But as currently constructed, the population bands are such that their funding has to go to areas under 5,000, areas over 200,000, and areas of 5,000 to 200,000, which really kind of left a weird situation for areas that are above 50,000, so have to have an MPO, but didn't necessarily have an assurance that they were going to get a proportional share of funding under STBGP within their areas. And this creates that population band and helps ensure that happens. It also expands project eligibility. I'm not going to get too much into that, but there are a number of new areas where STBG funds can be spent. Closely related, the Transportation Alternative Program sees, as mentioned, a very significant increase in funding. It's now pegged to 10% of STBGP funding. It doesn't take 10% away, but it's pegged to 10% of whatever STBGP is. So in this case, $72 billion for STBGP and $7.2 billion for the TAP program. In this case, suballocation was increased. It currently is at 50%. It will now go up to 59% of funds will be provided for local prioritization. States actually now have an option to allocate 100% of their funding if they choose to. So basically take themselves sort of out of the TAP game entirely and provide it all down to the local level. And one weird glitch that was solved in this bill is that MPOs serving a population of 50 to 200,000 are now eligible under TAP for unknown reasons. They were left out of being eligible in the past, and that has been corrected in this bill. Under metropolitan planning, there are some very important changes, not a lot of changes. This first bullet, while concerning on its face, I do think our impression is that this is going to apply when you're first designating officials upon the creation of the MPO. You must consider when designating officials the equitable and proportional representation of the population of the planning area. We're going to keep our eye on this one, make sure this isn't applied more broadly, but that is our impression, is that this will apply to new MPOs. Also requires consistency in planning data when there's more than one MPO within an urbanized area. Explicitly allows states and MPOs to use social media and other web-based tools for public participation. And then maybe most importantly, sort of bearing the lead here, it does add requirements for MPOs to consult with housing, affordable housing and other housing experts within their planning area when developing their plans. And for MPOs over 200,000, it makes allowable to develop a housing plan and integrate that plan into the transportation plan. So trying to bring together two issues that have sort of long been recognized as intimately tied together, are intimately tied together. This will give an opportunity in areas that wish to bring those two even more closely together and integrate some of the planning on housing with some of the planning on transportation. Under CMAQ, again, some new eligibilities there for micromobility, heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. Most importantly, probably, is that there's a change that funds may now be used for operating assistance, and there's no time limit on that in rural areas and in areas under 200,000 in population. So you can use CMAQ funds to support transit operations indefinitely in those areas. And then finally, a new provision that I think is one folks will definitely want to pay attention to if you are at an MPO, and that is this increasing safe and accessible transportation options. It requires that both states and MPOs are using at least 2.5% of their planning funds to carry out what can broadly be described as complete street type activities. Those include complete street standards, prioritization plan, development of other active transportation plans, planning, regional or mega regional planning to consider new alternatives to new highway capacity, transit-oriented development. So it's going to be required that 2.5% of your planning funds be used for activities that fall under this. And there's going to be, of course, have to be interpreted by USDOT, and I'm sure they will develop some criteria by which you'll be able to gauge how much of your planning funds are being used here. I am sure many of you already spend in excess of 2.5%, but still something you're going to want to keep an eye on just to make sure that we have a sense of what's being included here and what's not for going forward as they implement this. All right, so now let's talk about some of the new funding programs within the legislation. As mentioned, a couple new formula programs. The first one is the carbon reduction program. This is a formula only program. There's no discretionary element of this program, but very importantly, 65% of the funds that come through this program that go to the state will be sub-allocated to areas within the state by population, exactly the same way as it's done with STVGP. So funds will flow through the state to local areas via their MPO, with prioritization by the MPOs. There's a lot of eligible projects under this program. They include public transportation, bike ped projects, ITS, congestion pricing, and some others as well. In each state will have 2 years to develop a carbon reduction strategy that must be done in consultation with any MPOs within their state. In addition, any funds that are obligated under this program in rural areas the state will have to consult with the RTPO before doing that. The funding for this program, $6.4 billion over 5 years. The second new formula program is the PROTECT program. I keep meaning to write down what this stands for, and I keep forgetting, so it is a really long acronym. I don't remember it in its entirety, but it's a new program for resilience improvement. This contains, as I mentioned, both formula and competitive elements. The formula program Much of that will go to the state, and with a 2% set aside under that program for planning specifically. In addition, there's another $1.4 billion for competitive grants, and I'll get into those in a second. The eligible projects here are for things like storm surge protection, flood protection, aquatic ecosystem restoration after an event, things along those lines. MPOs themselves will be eligible to receive one of 4 discretionary grants under this program. Those include resilience planning grants and resilience improvement grants. So you can do the planning with one grant and execute projects with the other. There's a community resilience and evacuation route grant program, and finally an at-risk coastal infrastructure grant. The federal share on most of these will be 80%. In this case, they got a little creative as an inducement to develop a resilience improvement plan. The federal share can be increased by 7% in cases where the state or MPO has a resilience improvement plan in place and has prioritized the funded project within that plan. And MPOs can get another 3% increase in the federal share by incorporating their resilience plan into their metropolitan transportation plan. So this is a way to try and induce an action without requiring it, but by creating an incentive to do it. So those are the 2 new formula programs under the reauthorization portion of the bill. As mentioned, there are a few other formula programs for some other areas that are outside of reauthorization. So now let's talk about the discretionary grant programs. I'm going to touch on each one just a little bit. As I mentioned, this bill is chock full of detail. The Congress went a long way to try and do its very best to tell the administration exactly how to pick projects. Of course, that never entirely works. The administration has a lot of leeway as to how to implement these programs, but Congress always tries its darndest to put as many sort of strictures or requirements around it so that they can, that they think they'll control how the money flows out. But be that as it may, I'm going to give you a quick overview of all of these. I would highly encourage you to take a look at the analysis that I linked, that has been linked to in the chat, and that you can find at narc.org. You can find an unbelievable amount of detail about this, and even better, if you want to go back and read the text of the bill, you can obviously go back to the source as well. So let's work through these fairly quickly. First, the National Infrastructure Project Assistance Grants. This is for larger freight-related projects that can also be used for public transportation, passenger rail, movement of goods and people, but these are for larger projects. 50% for projects of 100 million to 500 million, and then another 50% for projects over $500 million. So these are very, very large projects, but there's $10 billion for this program over the life of the bill. The SMART program, Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation. Think Smart Cities Challenge type program, where you're going to receive funding for doing demonstration projects for advanced smart city tech. I'm going to get into some additional detail on this to illustrate some of what Congress has done in here. And that program gets $500 million over 5 years. You've got a Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. This is for improving and expanding surface transportation infrastructure in rural areas. But I will note, rural in this context is defined as an area outside an area of 200,000. So areas under 200,000 qualify as rural. And so that I think expands probably the eligibility for this more significantly than it might otherwise. That's receives $2 billion over the 5 years of the bill. You've got the discretionary portion of the Bridge Investment Program to encourage bridge repair, ostensibly on large. This is to replace some of the larger bridges in the nation, but will certainly apply more broadly than that. But I think these are funds thought to kickstart sort of larger bridge projects that might otherwise have a hard time getting the funding necessary. I think like Brent Spence is one that immediately comes to mind. MPOs over 200,000 in population can receive grants under this program, but projects must be within 18 months of completion and have their preliminary engineering complete when receiving funding. And this is the one that gets all kinds of funding from all different places, but the overall total is about $40 billion for the program itself. And the discretionary piece of that is somewhere in the $12 billion and can go up to about $15 billion. Doing some quick math there. Safe Streets and Roads for All. This is for competitive grants for Vision Zero, including requiring a comprehensive safety action plan. And actually the program requires that 40% of the funds be set aside for the development of that action plan, which is a very significant amount of money. It'll be interesting to see how that gets implemented, but there's $1 billion for this program over 5 years. And this program will fund both planning activities as well as implementation activities. Grants for charging and fueling infrastructure. This is to help get charging stations as well as fueling of alternative fuels out into the world. MPOs are eligible recipients. You can see the community grants. Half of the money must be reserved for these community grants to fill gaps in access to charging or fueling. And the total funding for this program, it gets $2.5 billion over the 5 years of the bill. A railroad crossing elimination program. You can imagine what that's for. MPOs are eligible to receive funds. This can include grade separation, track relocation, other types of safety projects. And the minimum grant size on this is $1 million, except for planning grants, which are also eligible under this program. And I don't have the total dollar spend there, and I don't remember what it's off the top of my head, so I'll have to get back on that. Congestion relief program, discretionary grants to advance things like integrated congestion management, perhaps HOV toll lanes, mobility services, and then carpooling incentives. Under this program, interstate tolling can be part of a project under specific circumstances. And in this case, MPOs over 1 million in population are eligible. And then states are actually eligible to obligate funds in urbanized areas under 1 million population, but that's ultimately a state decision. Funding here is $250 million over 5 years. There's a Healthy Streets program, specifically focused on use of cool and porous pavement and expanded tree cover. MPO is also eligible here, $500 million over 5 years for that program. The Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. This is a program added after the reauthorization bill passed, but was added in the final Senate negotiation. A new competitive grant program, really to work on sort of more systems type work with active transportation. So transportation spines or transportation networks, longer distance, maybe bike trails, things like that. Larger projects, the minimum project size is $15 million. So not necessarily striping a bike lane on a street, but more sort of longer term network systemic type projects. Eligible entities include regional governmental organizations, is how it's said in the bill, including MPOs and RTPOs. And the funding for this program is $1 billion over the 5 years. So I was going to spend just a minute and go into a little detail on one program, just to give you, not so much because I think this one is more important than any of the others, but because I think it helps to illustrate a little bit of the level of detail that Congress has gotten into, and that you can gain from sort of where they're trying to head with some of these programs. So the funding, as I mentioned, is $500 million for the SMART program. 40% of that goes to larger communities over 400,000 in population. 30% goes to communities 50,000 or less, and then the remaining 30% for 50 to 400,000. MPOs are eligible, as are public transit agencies and some others. And you can also have a partnership of 2 eligible entities apply as well. Eligible uses under this program are for both development phase, so for the planning and for the construction of projects. There are heavily extensive reporting requirements under this program, which makes sense. This is DOT trying to figure out what types of these approaches, these innovative approaches, might be worth either funding further, including in future legislation, things of that sort. So projects under this program should demonstrate at least one of this list of approaches. So coordinated automation, systems integration, smart grid technology, smart technology, traffic signals, and the like. And then it gets heavily also into selection criteria. So the extent to which you have a public transportation system, your population density, the continuity of committed leadership, I think is an interesting one. So you can see they're getting pretty specific about what some of the criteria should be for choosing which projects are going to get funded. But the advantage there is it gives you some advantage to know what they're looking for as you're thinking about projects that might fit under this. Again, a set of selection criteria, the extent to which any project will advance improvements and benefits under this extensive list of benefits here: congestion reduction, economic competitiveness, resilience, and on and on. And then further prioritizes projects that would be scalable, obviously that encourage innovation, promote a skilled workforce, encourage adoption of smart technologies by other communities, et cetera, et cetera. So again, pretty specific about the ways that they're trying to tell DOT how to structure this and for what types of projects they're trying to get funding to. Similarly, well, I'm not going to go into the heavy detail. I've got a few others in here that have it in, but I'll share the slides. Folks can see some of the more detail. Again, it's in the analysis that I've created as well. So I'm gonna slide by that one and talk just for a minute about some of the pilot programs, and then we will have time for some question and answer as well. So again, a fairly significant number of pilot programs, 6 or 7 by my count. The first one isn't really MPO or regional specific per se, but is sort of an important one, and that is the piloting of a national motor vehicle per mile user fee. So a VMT fee, whatever folks call it. Obviously, there's a wide recognition that the gas tax is unsustainable, both because Congress won't raise it and because cars are becoming much more efficient, if not entirely off of gasoline altogether. And so we need a solution, a funding solution going forward. Of course, this is perceived as perhaps one opportunity. I think there are a ton of questions about how this would play at the national level. So this is some funding set aside to basically do a pilot to study the concept of a national per mile fee in transportation. So very interesting, and we'll see how that stands up and what that ends up looking like. A very MPO specific provision is this prioritization process pilot program. Basically would give you some funds to do to develop a project scoring criteria based on the planning objectives you're trying to meet within your plan, and then use that criteria basically to judge or to score each of the projects that you're considering, and put the projects into your plan that score the highest on those developed criteria. So this is this one, as I mentioned, is very MPO specific. So wanted you to know about that one. Reconnecting Communities pilot program. This is an enormous enormous priority of the administration. Not only is there significant $1 billion in reauthorization, there's another, I think even larger, another big slug of money would be for this in the reconciliation bill as well. So very significant investment. These are for projects that would, or for approaches or projects that would either modify, move, or remove projects, legacy highways that impact communities. So thinking of interstates running through city center, for example. So it gives funds both at on the planning side as well as on the project side to do something about that. Transportation Access Pilot Program, again, another MPO and RTPO heavy provision. The idea here is take some funding to develop an accessibility data set and make that available to MPOs and RTPOs with the vision of using that to most likely eventually have some kind of transportation access component to the program, up to and including perhaps a performance measure that would look at transportation access. But before they can even contemplate that, they need to be more secure in the data, how it works, what they need, what's lacking, what the holes are, things like that. And so that's where that funding would go. And then Wildland crossing safety, I'm assuming there are some MPOs that are like, we don't have anything to do with this, but there may be others that this is actually something that they're interested in. This is to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and improve habitat connectivity. 60% of the funds have to be spent in rural areas, and this is a $350 million program for that. So very quickly, I will say this. You would think with all this new spending, they must have solved all the problems with the Highway Trust Fund and found a new source of funding. Of course, I've already told you that they haven't, because they're studying the per mile user fee. Instead, what they did is what they've done the last several reauthorizations, and that is just transfer in a whole ton of new money from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund. This transfer totals $118 billion, definitely the largest one to date. That would be $90 billion to the highway account, $28 billion to the transit account, and brings the total transfers since 2008, when they started transferring, up to $270 billion, which is a heck of a lot of cheese. We can only presume, since the IIJA really does nothing to fix highway trust fund solvency beyond this transfer, beyond the 5 years of the reauthorization, the future cliff is going to be that much worse. So if this time it took $118 billion transfer, it could be that next time it takes a $180 billion transfer, if that's the way they're going to do it again. So as mentioned, the only thing they really did was this user fee study, but that does absolutely nothing for solvency here in the very near term. So, all right, so then the question is, what is next? Well, the bill's passed, so we're just waiting for signature. The president has indicated he's going to wait, I believe, until next week to sign the bill. And from there, we are going to see a tremendous amount of rulemaking, a tremendous amount of writing new programs, and then eventually we're going to get to distributing funds and publishing those NOFAs to let you know that there are funds available. How DOT does this is going to be extremely important because there are so many different areas and so much of it is discretionary that we don't want communities or MPOs or anybody to get sort of buried in applications and take themselves out of contention or not even apply because of the time and effort it takes. So it's going to be really important that US DOT, which I know they recognize the onslaught that's about to come, but I'm hoping they do a great job strategizing as to how to really help communities make sure that they're eligible, that they are fit with the right programs for them, and that they're able to get some funds for the projects that they find most important. I did a webinar yesterday with Leslie Mozingo, if you know her, with some of the folks in North Carolina, and I left her bulletin because it was so good about thinking ahead and planning early. I did thinking about the provisions that are in this bill, getting really familiar with them on the front end early on to figure out which ones might fit the things that you're trying to accomplish. She advised that if you don't have a grant writer and you're thinking about hiring one or could hire one, that now might be the right time because of what's going to be coming in terms of applying for these things. Asking for help, whether that's from us or if you have a Washington rep or anybody else that you rely on for this type of help. And then she advises that as soon as you know you want to apply for something, make sure you let your members of Congress know that you're going for them, because they were not able to earmark this time around, though they tried in the House bill. That did not come to pass. So there's going to be members of Congress very interested in making sure that they're able to indicate that they helped bring projects home to districts, and this is going to be the absolute #1 way that this is going to happen. In addition, NARC and AMPO are developing a process to help provide some feedback to the administration in something of an informal way. We're asking for members to come together and do some analysis of some specific sections of the bill to indicate to the administration some thoughts and ideas of how they might be thinking about implementing those to make sure that MPOs, regional councils, RTPOs are represented to the extent possible. When this webinar ends today, you will get a survey, and that survey has a question about whether you're interested in participating in such an effort. If you are, please just fill out your name and email address in the box that pops up on that survey, and we will add you to the list and make sure that you're included included in that. So before I go to questions, I do have one more poll question, and that is about the potential for future webinars. One thing that we've contemplated is maybe doing something that gets deeper into the details of these programs, and talks a little bit more specifically, takes the deeper dive into some of the things like I talked about with the SMART program, like what they're looking for, the types of projects that could be funded. I'm seeing extremely enthusiastic response here, as I expected that I would. It's good to hear that folks are interested in that. That is something that we'll consider putting together. I just think it's really important. The more information you have, the earlier you have it, and the more you're thinking about this proactively, I think it's really going to make a big difference in your being able to go out there and compete for funds. So I'm going to go ahead and end this, just because I can tell you from here it is 100% unanimous that, and a lot of folks responded. So there's definitely a lot of interest in this, and this is great to know. So let's see. All right. Well, thank you for that. I do appreciate it. All right. So that is what I had. I am more than happy to answer questions that folks have. Chuck asked about SMART, including technology for freight. Freight will absolutely be part of that program. I am sure, and I can pull out the specific language, but I am sure freight will be part of that that approach. So, and if folks can either type things into the Q&A, or if you raise your hand, I can also unmute you if you'd prefer to do it that way. It doesn't matter to me what folks want to do, but I'm happy to answer questions that anybody has. I do not see any in there now, so I'll give it a couple more minutes. There's no way I baffled everybody that much. Maybe everybody's sleeping. And I'll also make sure, since it's hard to keep up with, I will definitely provide a copy of the PowerPoint. And if anybody asks any questions in the chat that I haven't been able to keep up with, I will be more than happy to reach you offline if I missed anything. Let's see, a couple did come through. Maybe there's a question about, if you already have a comprehensive safety action plan, will a Safe Streets safety grant still be possible? I believe so, because I believe you'll then be able to get funding to implement your plan. So I think there will be both planning side and project side funding under that program, is my best guess. So I think that yes, the answer is you would be able to potentially get a grant there. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come through. I really appreciate folks on the line today. Oh, let's see, maybe another one coming through. Oh, people have been asking in the chat. I see. Okay, let's see if I can. A question about when the competitive grant funds will be available. I think that is an excellent question. I can actually posit a couple of different paths forward as to what projects and programs they might implement first. I think part of it is going to be based on a strong desire to get funds out as quickly as possible, to get projects completed as quickly as possible, ideally maybe even some of them before the midterm elections, and certainly before the 2024 election. And so I think all of that is going to factor into how they prioritize which of these to do. They're obviously not going to be able to do all of them at one time. And so it's going to be sort of an open process of rolling these out over a period of time. So I think it's going to be, it's really hard to predict what's going to be first. We're doing our best to figure out where their priorities lie primarily. And obviously that's information that we want to share and make available as quickly as possible. That's a good question. Kevin asked about the requirement for 2.5% of planning funds for complete street activities, whether it applies to both FHWA and the transit metropolitan planning funds. And the short answer is I'm not sure. It's a great question. I will definitely look into that and get back to you. Let's see, I think Jess is trying to save me here and work through some questions, but I'm trying to find. All right, let's see if I can find any others quickly. Hold on. Should housing and carbon reduction and perhaps other areas be considered new planning factors, or will that be forthcoming in the guidance? I think the short answer is it will be forthcoming, but I think given the prominence that those will have, especially for MPOs over 200,000 who can integrate some of these housing considerations into their plans, that it would not surprise me that those become planning factors, but that will be up to them about how to implement that. We may get a full planning rule from this. It's not clear yet if that's going to be the case, but somebody asked, when do all the new policies become effective? I mean, to some extent, fairly quickly, because this applied to this fiscal year, I believe is when it starts. So, but there's definitely going to have to be a lot of rulemaking for a number of these areas. So I'm sure we're going to see something fairly quickly from the relevant modal agencies indicating what may have changed immediately and what is going to require some kind of rulemaking. It'll, I guess, really depend on what their read of that is. And I'm sure they are very hard at work trying to answer that question as well. Question, will state DOTs now be required to share TAP funds? One thing I should have actually mentioned that I did not, and I was remiss in doing so, is very importantly, not only will MPOs of 50 to 200,000 now have like their own population limit, so states will have to provide a proportional share of funds to those areas. In addition to that, for all of the TAP funds, they now come with proportional obligation. The lack of proportional obligation meant that these dollars always slid to the bottom of states' desire to spend because they wanted to use their obligation authority for other areas, for road building or for other projects, and TAP always slid to the bottom. Now, with this bill, obligation authority comes attached to these dollars, and so it's going to make it much easier to spend these funds, no doubt about it. So it's actually like there's a bunch of whammies that exist within the TAP program that make it really a much better program, and one that I think is going to be much more impactful, much easier for folks to spend the dollars. There's a whole bunch of things in that program that I think are big improvements. So keep an eye out for that, but I think that's really going to be a great step forward. Question about the historical suballocation for STBGP prior to 55%. It had been 50% previous to the FAST Act. And then before that, it was a different percentage. It was 63.5%, I believe, but of a different sort of calculus. It was of a different set of programs. So we've long argued we should get it back up to that historical number, which would be a very nice increase in STBGP. I believe maybe it was 62.5%. But again, the calculation was a little different then because it was a different program. So, but that's the most relevant sort of comparison is to the 50% that was there before we were able to increase that last time around. Let's see, we got another one. Question about whether we have to wait for the appropriations bills to pass before increases in the metropolitan planning funds. No, that funding will increase. That's authorized dollars, and under the transportation program, it doesn't require additional action in order to be spendable. So I don't know exactly how that's going to roll out, but that will not or should not require any action by appropriations to spend. All right, if anybody has any additional questions, please let me know. I see a lot of people hopping off. We are at the hour. I made this for 90 minutes, but I thought maybe I'd be able to give a half hour back. When I close this out, as I said, if you're interested in joining us on this endeavor to take a look at some of the provisions of this bill, please give me your name and email address. And otherwise, I will say thank you very much for joining us. And you'll hear again from us very soon on this bill, I am sure. Thanks and have a great day.